Welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Institute Online Lincoln Symposium. My name is Michelle Crowell, and I will serve as the host of this first of two programs in the series. This live-streamed speaker symposium is focused on the life, times, and legacy of President Abraham Lincoln. You can learn more about the previously recorded ALI symposium programs by visiting the Abraham Lincoln Institute website at www.lincoln-institute.org or the Ford's Theater website at www.fords.org. A note to all our viewers, we are taking your questions on our social media platforms. The two Q&A sessions today will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Edna Green Medford. Please feel free to submit your questions so that we may share them with the speakers during their respective Q&A time. Finally, the Abraham Lincoln Institute would like to take this opportunity to thank Paul Tatro, Erica Scott, Carolina Dulce, Lauren B.A., Andrea Bowman, Andrew Bushbaum, and the staff of Ford's Theater for all their hard work to make this virtual symposium possible. Our first speaker is Dr. Jonathan W. White. Dr. White is a professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. In 2019, he won the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia's Outstanding Faculty Award, the highest honor bestowed upon college faculty by the Commonwealth of Virginia. He serves as vice chair of the Lincoln Forum, on the Ford's Theater Advisory Council, and on the board of the Abraham Lincoln Institute. He is the author or editor of 13 books that cover a variety of topics, including civil liberties during the Civil War, the USS Monitor and the Battle of Hampton Roads, the presidential election of 1864, and what Civil War soldiers dreamt about. His most recent books are To Address You as My Friend, African Americans' Letters to Abraham Lincoln, and, appropriately published on Lincoln's birthday this year, A House Built by Slaves, African American Visitors to the Lincoln White House. As a quick note to viewers, Dr. White has another commitment directly after his Q&A session, so please be sure to submit your questions for him during his presentation. Speaking today on Abraham Lincoln and his African American correspondence, we welcome Dr. Jonathan White to the program.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you to ALI for hosting this incredible event and to Ford's Theater for making it all happen. I wish we could be in Washington right now on the stage at Ford's, but I'm so grateful to the staff of Ford's for putting this on for us. Today, I'm going to talk about two books that I just published. The first one came out in October, and it's called To Address You as My Friend. I had the idea around 2014 to start collecting letters from African Americans to Abraham Lincoln. And I'm not sure exactly where the idea came from, but over the course of the ensuing 5 or 6 years, I found 125 letters from African Americans to Lincoln. And I'll talk about some of those today, and then I'll also talk about a project that grew out of this collection of correspondence. The letters that African Americans sent to Lincoln touch on every aspect of African American life in the 19th century. They touch on problems with equality, racial discrimination, wanting to serve in the Union Army, land disputes, requests for pardons. Whenever African Americans, or I shouldn't say whenever, but in a number of cases when African Americans had problems that they were facing, they tried to pull the different levers of the government to deal with those problems. And for the first time in American history, they believed that they had a president that they could appeal to in Abraham Lincoln. And so they claimed a First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, and they wrote directly to Lincoln. They also wrote to Lincoln sometimes to thank him for emancipation or to let him know about other things that they're doing or learning. And one letter that has always jumped out at me is this one from a man named Hannibal Cox. Now, Hannibal Cox had been born into slavery near Richmond, Virginia. And if you look, I don't know how well you can see it, but if you look at the top of this letter, you can see how he was born near Richmond and he was denied education as an enslaved man. And that was common in the South during the years before the Civil War. It was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read and write. But Hannibal Cox escaped from slavery and became a Union soldier. And as a soldier, he began to learn how to read and write. And he sent this really touching letter to Lincoln. And if you look at it, he tells his story very quickly at the beginning. And then he actually copied some lines of poetry out of Harper's Weekly, one of the major newspapers of the day. But the thing I love about this letter is that not only is Cox trying to show Lincoln what he's learning, how he's learning to read and write, but he very truly believes that his commander-in-chief will hold this letter in his hands. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a little postscript that Cox wrote. He wrote, "I send this for you to look at. You must not laugh at it." And I think it's such a touching sentiment that Cox put into this letter, because so often when someone struggles in a way, people's natural reaction is to laugh at them. And so Cox knew and believed that Lincoln might actually hold this letter in his hand, and that his natural reaction would be to laugh at Cox's penmanship or spelling errors, grammatical errors, things like that. But he wanted Lincoln to look at it and take him seriously. And I think it's such a touching letter. And Lincoln, as far as I can believe, held this letter in his hands and was moved by it enough to keep it, because this letter is now part of his personal collection of papers at the Library of Congress. It's not a letter that he routed through the bureaucracy of the federal government. Lincoln kept this one in his possession, and it was still in his possession at the time of his assassination. Now, African Americans did not simply write to Lincoln. They also claimed the right and the privilege to be able to go to the White House to meet with him. And so this is the subject of a book I published, as Michelle noted, on Lincoln's birthday this year, A House Built by Slaves. Now, I'm sitting in my office at Christopher Newport University right now, and I have a note on my door that asks students not to interrupt, because they know that as a general rule, if I'm in my office, they can come knock on my door and visit me during office hours. And one of the things that's intriguing about the 19th century presidency is that Lincoln held office hours much as a college professor does today. And ordinary Americans who wanted to could go to the White House to meet with the president and talk to him about anything they wanted to. They could ask for patronage, or they could ask for a pardon, whatever was on their minds. If you've seen the Lincoln movie, the Spielberg movie, you've seen a scene that I think wonderfully captures this aspect of Lincoln's daily life during his presidency. For the first year of the Civil War, only white Americans claim this privilege to go to the White House, wait in line, and eventually have their turn with the president. But beginning as early as April of 1862, African Americans make this claim as well. And what they're doing when they go to meet with the president is making a claim for citizenship, that we are citizens, we have a right to go meet with the president. He is our president, just like he is the president of white Americans. This is our people's house, just like the White House is known as the people's house. And so what I'm going to do for the remainder of my time is tell a couple of stories of some of the men who wrote to Abraham Lincoln and met with Lincoln during the Civil War. One of the most famous is a man named Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls had been born into slavery in South Carolina. And in May of 1862, he hatched a plan to steal this Confederate ship, the CSS Planter, and take her out of Charleston Harbor, out to the Union blockading vessels. And this was a very dangerous plan, because not only did Smalls have to make it past all of the guards that were in, the Confederate guards who were in Charleston Harbor, but then he had to persuade the Union blockaders that he was not a Confederate ship on the attack. And so he got together several friends, and before dawn on May 13th, 1862, Smalls and 15 other people steal this Confederate ship and take her out to sea. Aboard the ship with him were several women and children, including his wife and 2 children and some of the other men's wives and children. Smalls was wearing an outfit that made him look like a sailor, and he had been working on the Planter for some time. So he knew the signals that he needed to do as he took the Planter out to sea. And so he signaled to the Confederate guards, and they think it's a Confederate ship with a white captain taking it out to sea, and they let him go by. And then he makes it out to the Union blockaders. And at first they think it's a Confederate ship on the attack, and he's in grave danger. But he's able to signal to them that he is not a Confederate, and he turns this ship over to Union authorities. And this is a really incredible moment where Smalls steals his freedom and the freedom of 15 other people. He was only 23 years old when he did it. And because of this daring escape, he became a national hero. One New York newspaper wrote about him with a mixture of admiration and condescension, saying, "This man, though black, is a hero, one of the few history will delight to honor. He has done something for his race and for the world of mankind." And then this paper added, "He has added new proof to the evidence that Negroes have skill and courage and tact, and that they will risk their lives for the sake of liberty." Well, Smalls became a national hero. Newspapers throughout the North are reporting on what he did. In May of 1862, within about 2 weeks, Congress passes a law that Lincoln signs, giving him some of the salvage money, the value of the ship. And in August of 1862, he travels to Washington, D.C. He gives a lecture at Israel AME Church, which was pastored by this man here, Henry McNeill Turner. And he spoke before a mixed-race audience of 1,200 people, telling the brave story of his escape. And Henry McNeill Turner was captivated by this lecture. He called it a great success, and he said that Smalls was a living specimen of unquestionable African heroism. Well, while he was in Washington, Smalls also went to the White House to meet with Abraham Lincoln. And we don't have a firsthand account from 1862 of what this meeting was like, but we have to imagine that Abraham Lincoln wanted to hear the story of Smalls's escape. And he very well may have asked Smalls to tell him this story. How did you steal the planter? What happened? What was it like? Now, why does this meeting matter? Well, first of all, it's very early in Lincoln's presidency, and he is meeting with someone who just months earlier was bound in slavery. But there's an even greater significance to this meeting. Prior to the fall of 1862, Abraham Lincoln had opposed allowing black men to serve in the Union Army. For political reasons, he had feared political fallout. What is the white Northern electorate going to say if I allow black men to serve in the Army? But he also had a fear that African American men would be cowardly if they were on the battlefield. He said at one point that if we put guns into their hands, they might just as quickly wind up in the hands of Confederates. But here Lincoln met a man who had acted with daring and bravery and skill to steal freedom for himself and 15 other people. And it showed that black men could and would act with courage. And Smalls went back to Beaufort, South Carolina after meeting with Lincoln, bearing a letter from the War Department that authorized the beginning of recruitment of black soldiers in the Sea Isles of South Carolina. And that would then lead to the 1st and 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. I believe it was a meeting between Lincoln and Robert Smalls that helped bring about this change that would have eventually lead to 180,000 men serving in the Union Army. Now, just because men are now able to serve in the Union Army, and that starts on a grand scale after the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, just because they are allowed to join the Union Army does not mean that they have full equality. They are in segregated units with white officers. They are given less pay than they had been promised. They expected to receive $13 a month, the same pay as white soldiers. But instead, they are paid under the Militia Act of 1862. They're paid as laborers, which says that they get only $10 a month. And not only that, laborers have an additional $3 deducted from their pay. So when they expect to be getting $13 a month, they're really only getting $7. And to top it all off, the Confederate government has said that African Americans caught on the battlefield will be treated as slaves in servile insurrection, and they will either be sold into slavery or executed. And so African Americans who join the Army and their families at home are serving at great cost and extraordinary risk. Now, Frederick Douglass had been working as a recruiter for black soldiers for the 54th Massachusetts. He had 2 sons who joined that very famous regiment. And he was livid that African Americans were not getting equal pay and that they were at the risk of suffering from Confederate atrocities. So in August of 1863, Frederick Douglass went to the White House, unannounced and uninvited, shows up, doesn't know whether or not he will be welcomed in by the president. Lincoln welcomed him in. They sit down together and have a conversation. And Douglass presses him on these issues. On the pay issue, Lincoln responds that the Northern electorate, political sentiment there will not allow for equal pay at this time, that it will eventually come, but for now, Black soldiers should consider some sort of monetary value in the giving of freedom. On the issue of Confederate atrocities, Lincoln says that if he could capture the men who commit atrocities and war crimes, he would do it. But he finds it revolting, Lincoln says, to think about executing Confederate POWs who have not committed a war crime. Now, as you might imagine, Frederick Douglass was not altogether satisfied with these answers. But he went away with a new appreciation of the political constraints that were on Lincoln as a wartime president with a white racist electorate that he had to think about in the North. And he also went away with an appreciation for the fact that Lincoln treated him as a man in this meeting. Douglass gave a speech a few months later in December of 1863. And he said to the audience, I have been to Washington to see the president. And as you were not there, perhaps you would like to know how the president of the United States received a Black man at the White House. And Douglass paused and then said, he received me just as one gentleman would receive another. And at that, the audience erupted in applause. And then Douglass said, with a hand and a voice well balanced between kind cordiality and respectful reserve, he welcomed me in. And Douglass said, to great laughter, I felt big there. Now, Smalls and Douglass were famous, but it was not only famous people who met with Lincoln at the White House. One of my favorites is this man here, Alexander Augusta. Alexander Augusta was born in Norfolk, Virginia, about 30 minutes away from where I'm sitting right now. He was born into a free Black family. They eventually left Virginia and moved to Baltimore. He wanted to attend medical school, and he applied to a medical school in Philadelphia and was denied admission on account of his race. And so he moved to Toronto, where he trained and became a medical doctor, and then trained other Black men to become doctors. When the Civil War came around, Augusta was practicing medicine in Toronto, and shortly after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Augusta realized he now had an opportunity to return to the United States to, he said, be of use to my race. And within a week of the Emancipation Proclamation, Augusta sent this letter to Abraham Lincoln asking to become an army doctor and saying that he would like to serve his race and his country in that way. Well, the War Department invited Augusta to Washington to be examined. And when the examining surgeons saw that he, in their words, appears to be of African descent, they asked the War Department to rescind his invitation. Fortunately, Edwin Stanton refused to cave to their racist desire. So Augusta was examined. The examining surgeons put him through what one person then called a squeezing process, the hardest questions they could come up with. But Augusta passed with flying colors. Shortly after the exam, the Surgeon General said to the examining surgeon, I say, Cronin, how was it that you could let the N-word pass? And Dr. Cronin responded, the truth is, General, the N-word knew more than I did, and I couldn't help myself. And so Alexander Augusta is commissioned a major in the Union Army, the highest ranking Black officer of the Civil War era. But just because he's now in the Army does not mean that he will no longer face discrimination. He is beaten up by a rowdy mob who rips off his shoulder straps in Baltimore in May of 1863. And in early 1864, he is told that he is not allowed to ride on a streetcar in Washington, D.C., that he can either sit outside of the streetcar with the driver up front, or he can walk through the muddy streets of Washington. Now, Augusta refuses to take these assaults and insults passively, and he takes his story to the press, and it makes these issues make national news. They get debated on the floor of the Senate. And one newspaper very snidely remarks that if Augusta is facing all of these troubles, he should take them directly to the commander-in-chief. Now, I doubt that Augusta actually read that report. It was written in a paper in Indiana, I believe, but that's exactly what he did. In February of 1864, Alexander Augusta and another Black doctor who he had actually trained in Toronto put on their winter wraps, put on their uniforms and their winter wraps, and went to the White House for a public reception. They showed up at the door uninvited. They take off their coats, hand them to a servant. They get in line. They go to meet the president. When Lincoln sees Augusta and Abbott, Lincoln, and this was Abbott's word, Lincoln eagerly approached them, and Lincoln shook Augusta's hand. At that, Mary Lincoln looks over and sees this and does not like what she sees. She sends her son Robert over to intervene, and Robert goes up to his father and says, "Are you going to allow this to happen?" And Lincoln turns to his son and says, "Why not?" Robert slinks back over to his mother. Lincoln turns back to Augusta, shakes his hand again, turns to Abbott and shakes his hand. And then these two Black men walk through the beautiful East Room of the White House. And people who saw this scene were amazed by what they saw. Lincoln's secretary, William Stoddard, was there, and he said, "I shall never forget the sensation produced at a levee by the appearance of two tall and very well-dressed Africans among the crowd of those who came to pay their respects." Stoddard said, "It was a practical assertion of Negro citizenship for which few were prepared." But he said Lincoln received them with marked kindness. And this is an incredible moment where they are making a claim. We are soldiers of this country. We are citizens. We deserve this right to come meet with the president, just like any other white person would have this right. African Americans also make even more direct claims for citizenship. On March 3rd, so about 10 days later, a delegation of two men from Louisiana bring a petition signed by 1,000 people calling for wealthy, freeborn, tax-paying, light-skinned Creoles of Louisiana to have the right to vote. And their argument is, we pay taxes, we are educated, and we serve in the army. And by the way, our ancestors did too. In fact, 28 of the first 30 signatures were veterans of Andrew Jackson's army from the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. And they meet with Lincoln on March 3rd and present this petition to him. And Lincoln sits down with them and has a conversation about this petition. And he essentially says, "I agree with you. You should have the right to vote. But as president, this is not within my authority. This has to do with the power of the state. Suffrage is a state matter." Well, the men go away and think about it. And then they write out a new petition 7 days later. And I can't prove this, but I think they returned to the White House on March 12th to present this new petition to Lincoln. And in this new petition, they call for the right to vote for all Black men, whether they were born into slavery or not, whether they're educated or not, whether they're taxpayers or not. And they have a new rationale for Black suffrage. They say that giving Black men the right to vote will give, and this is their words, full effect to all the Union feeling in the rebel states in order to secure the permanence of the free institutions and loyal governments now organized therein. In other words, there are millions of traitors in the South, and there's a loyal population of 4 million people who are enslaved. And when Reconstruction comes, giving them the right to vote will help preserve small r Republican government. What I love about this moment is these men came to Lincoln with a request, and he listened to them, and he responded, and they listened to him, and they responded, and he listened. The very next day, March 13th, 1864, Lincoln sends a letter to the governor-elect of Louisiana, a man named Michael Hahn. And Lincoln says this: "I barely suggest for your private consideration whether some of the colored people may not be let in," meaning let into the right to vote. "As, for instance, the very intelligent, and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks. They would probably help in some trying time to come to keep the jewel of liberty within the family of freedom." In other words, Lincoln listened to the new rationale of this delegation from Louisiana, and he began working behind the scenes to push for Black suffrage. And for the next year, Lincoln would work behind the scenes to try to bring about Black suffrage at the state level as Southern states were being reconstructed. He would finally come out publicly in favor of Black suffrage on April 11th, 1865. And of course, as I'm sure many in the audience know, John Wilkes Booth was in the audience that night. And he said, that means N-word citizenship. By God, I'll now put him through. It was interactions with African Americans that really pushed Lincoln in this way. Lincoln met with another delegation the following month in April of 1864. This delegation involved free Blacks from North Carolina as well as former slaves. They were led by Abraham Galloway. And again, Lincoln was supportive of their right to vote, pushed them to push for it at the state level in North Carolina. What struck this delegation most was how Lincoln welcomed them through the front door and brought them in and shook their hands. They said they felt like they were treated like the ambassadors from Japan. At the end of that year, or in the summer of 1864, Lincoln was nominated for re-election as the Republican candidate for president. But the war went very badly for the Union in the spring and summer of 1864, and Lincoln became convinced that he would lose re-election. And so in August of 1864, he reached out to Frederick Douglass and invited him to return to the White House. So the first time Douglass went in August of 1863, uninvited. This time he comes at the president's behest. And they sit down together and they talk about politics and some matters in the election of 1864. And then Lincoln turns to him and says, Douglass, I hate slavery as much as you do. I want to see it abolished altogether. And Lincoln says that the slaves are not running away as quickly as he had hoped they would. And he worries that he'll be out of office and the next president will rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln and Douglass then together concoct a plan modeled after John Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry to send what Douglass calls bands of scouts into the Confederacy, telling slaves to run away now while they still have a chance. Because if Lincoln loses election in November of 1864, he will be out of office the following March, and their golden opportunity for freedom will be gone. Now, fortunately, things took a turn for the better in September and October of 1864, and Lincoln sailed into re-election. So they never had to carry out this plan of sending bands of scouts into the Confederacy. But this is a moment that transformed the way Douglass thought about Lincoln. And I think it's very important for how we think about emancipation. When we think about emancipation, we often think about military necessity and saving the Union, that Lincoln only freed the slaves because he had to win the war. But in this moment, Douglass realized that Lincoln's heart was fully in emancipation. Freeing the slaves at this time in this way had nothing to do with military necessity, had nothing to do with saving the Union or winning the war. It had everything to do with freeing as many people before Lincoln was out of power. And I think it's a really important moment for helping us understand emancipation. As Lincoln traveled around Washington, D.C., he treated the Black refugees he met with dignity and respect. In May of 1862, he met 3 Black cooks at an Army hospital in Washington, and a white Army nurse introduced him to them, and he shook their hands and learned their names. How do you do, Lucy? How do you do, Garner? How do you do, Brown? And there were white convalescing soldiers who watched this scene who were furious that he treated Black people with respect. But that was exactly how Lincoln treated them. He would travel back and forth between the White House and the soldiers' home in Northwest Washington. And periodically, while making this trip, he would stop at the contraband camp near where Howard University is today. And if you look very closely at this picture, you can see these Black refugees holding little books. They are preparing to sing for Lincoln. And there are accounts of Lincoln left by one of the contrabands, a woman named Mary Dines, about how Lincoln would sing with the contrabands, how his tears would be coming out of his eyes as he listened and he sang. And one of the things that struck me in Mary Dines' recollections of singing with the president is she said that the contrabands would become very charismatic in shouting and dancing as they sang. And she said, but Lincoln never laughed at us. And there's that sentiment again that we see in Hannibal Cox's letter, that when Lincoln interacted with whether they were white or black, male or female, slave or free, Lincoln treated people with respect when he interacted with them. And it's little wonder to me that when Lincoln died, African Americans felt that loss greater than I think white Americans did. And I want to close with just an excerpt from the diary of Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, because I think he captured, by witnessing it, the sorrow that African Americans felt. On the day that Lincoln died, April 15th, 1865, Welles noted in his diary, he said, several hundred colored people, mostly women and children, weeping and wailing their loss, were on Pennsylvania Avenue outside of the White House. Welles said, this crowd did not appear to diminish through the whole of that cold, wet day. They seemed not to know what was to be their fate, since their great benefactor was dead. And their hopeless grief affected me more than almost anything else, though strong and brave men wept when I met them. And I hope that what my remarks and Wells's observations capture is that a very special relationship developed between Lincoln and African Americans during the Civil War era. And I think it's a story that's been largely lost until just within the last 6 months or so, with my books and Michael Burlingame's book coming out. So with that, thank you so much for having me. And I would love to take your questions.
Thank you, Professor White. While we gather the questions from the audience, I have a couple for you.
Sure.
What do we know about Lincoln's awareness of these letters that African Americans are sending? You know, we know that the president today has a whole staff of people who are answering letters. I doubt seriously if Lincoln is answering these letters himself. He certainly did not have the time.
Right.
So who's doing that? And how is it determined which letters he will get to see and act on?
Yeah, so Lincoln came to Washington with two private secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay. And then over the course of the war, he hires some others. And they operated under the rule of refer as little to the president as possible. So the estimates are that Lincoln received somewhere between 200 and 300. David Herbert Donald estimated that Lincoln received between 200 and 300 letters a day. And as you said, clearly he couldn't respond to that many. It feels like my inbox sometimes, 200 to 300 emails a day. And so what his private secretaries do is they read the incoming correspondence. A lot of the hate mail they would burn. So sadly for us as historians, most of the hate mail does not survive. But the letters asking for things, they figure out what department or bureau or agency of the federal government should handle this. And then they route it to that agency. And sometimes those letters would come back to Lincoln and then he might make a notation on the back of them. Sometimes they just get sent out to someone else to resolve the problem. And so we have a sense of then who handled the letters based on where those letters are today. So in the book, I've got 125 letters. 4 of them were public letters in the newspapers. About 20 or 21 are in the Lincoln papers at the Library of Congress. So those are ones that he, for whatever reason, chose to keep. And then the other 100 are in a smattering of record groups at the National Archives. In the book itself, I would guess that Lincoln personally handled at least a quarter of the letters. He has notations on a number of them, and then others were pardon cases where he would have reviewed the letter in the file and then made a determination about whether or not to pardon. But it was very rare that Lincoln personally responded to any letters, let alone letters from African Americans.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned that in going to the White House and in writing letters to Lincoln, African Americans are asserting what they see as their rights to citizenship. Uh, can it be as well that there are some who are formerly enslaved who are just simply substituting Lincoln for the person who had control over them when they were enslaved? So is this a new master, so to speak? I don't. I wonder if enslaved people or formerly enslaved people saw Lincoln as the most powerful person in the country and therefore wrote to him because he was the most powerful person in the country, as opposed to them having any concerns about exercising their rights of citizenship. Certainly, Northerners who would have had a closer association with the government would have been doing that, but would formerly enslaved people have
Yeah,
done
I
that?
think you get both. There are formerly enslaved people who write to Lincoln calling for equality. Or so they write to him about land. They want the land they're working. In one case, a man wrote from Virginia and said, my master has fled and I'm working this land and I want to know, is it mine? So that I know if I should improve it, build a home or something on it. So, but on the point about is he a new master? I think it's a really interesting question. So Benjamin Quarles did a book 50, 60 years ago called Lincoln and the Negro.
Yes.
And one of his really important insights is that for Black politics in the 19th century, African Americans often equate a person with the government.
Mhm.
And so for them, Lincoln is the government. And so it is kind of what you're describing. It's little wonder that many former slaves call him Master Lincoln or Massa Lincoln. And when Lincoln died, there are some former slaves who say the government has died because
Mhm.
they equate him with that government.
Right.
And so you find Elizabeth Keckley writes about this in her memoir. She writes about a woman who comes to the White House and is really angry because she's used to her mistress or her master giving her a new dress every year. And she comes to the White House wondering, where's my new shift?
Mhm.
And she just expects Lincoln is now in that role. He should be giving me my new shift. And Keckley laughs at that, at the thought of that. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. For many, I think there is that sort of Lincoln is now in a different role. But I do really believe that for many of the people writing to Lincoln, and especially those who meet with Lincoln, they are claiming a right that had been denied them for generations. So in the research for the book, I tried to document every case I could find of Black men or women. I couldn't find any women before the Civil War going to the White House. And I found a half dozen. And I'm sure there's more that I just couldn't find. But what I suggest in the introduction to the book is that African Americans were more likely to be bought and sold by a sitting president than welcomed as a guest. James K. Polk
Sure.
bought and sold 19 people during his presidency.
Mhm. Absolutely. So you mentioned Alexander Augusta as one of the persons who attended a reception at the White House. He may not have been famous at the time, but he certainly was important at the
Yes.
time. And so I'm wondering how many people off the street would have just showed up at the White House. Not, and I know this is not a part of your study, but
Yeah.
not just African Americans, but
Yeah.
white Americans as well. Are there people who are simply saying, I'm going to go to see the president because I'm having a problem and
Yeah.
he's going to tend to it? Or are you seeing people who are fairly prominent, at least in the African American community, who feel that they have the right to come to talk to the president?
Yeah, it is ordinary people, white and Black. And now for many of the ordinary people, we just can't know because they maybe didn't leave a written account, or you find in the newspapers mention of someone who's nameless. And so we just can't confirm who it was. The accounts of, especially at the beginning of Lincoln's presidency, people are showing up early in the morning. They are lining the hallways all the way up the stairs to his second floor office, just waiting for their turn to meet with the president. And that's still going on late in his presidency. So a great example would be Sojourner Truth. So she goes to meet with Lincoln on October 29th, 1864. By one account, she has to wait 3 hours until she finally gets in. And while she's waiting, she overhears a conversation of two unnamed Black women who go to Lincoln to request financial assistance. I think one of them maybe both had husbands in the army, and they were destitute and they needed help. We will never know their names or ultimately what happened to them, but they do testify to the fact that there are unknown people who are ordinary Americans, white and Black, meeting Lincoln.
And so let's sort of follow along with the whole Sojourner Truth story.
Yeah.
Do you think Lincoln distinguished between African Americans? Certainly, he treated Douglass well, and he treated other Black men well. But when I look at what he says to Sojourner Truth, it sort of strikes me as being different. And so he calls her auntie, as opposed to, Ms. Truth or Mrs. Truth or Ms. Truth or whatever. He seems to dismiss her in a way that he doesn't with Black men, especially Black men who would have been more prominent than she. So do you get a sense that he is distinguishing between groups of African Americans?
So the Sojourner Truth one is tricky. And the way we interpret Sojourner Truth depends on what accounts of that meeting we rely on. And so a lot of modern scholars rely on Lucy Coleman's 1890s memoir of that meeting. And Lucy Coleman attributes words to Lincoln that he never would have said in October of 1864. And I think in her memory, she was thinking about the very famous Greeley letter from August of 1862, and she puts that into Lincoln's mouth in October of 1864. And I don't think it's reliable. And Coleman hated Lincoln. I mean, she hated Lincoln. And so I think that colors her recollection 30 years later. So I rely most heavily on two accounts from November of 1864, so written within a week of the meeting. One is from Sojourner Truth. Now, she was illiterate. She dictated it to someone who then wrote it and published it in the Liberator. And the other is from Lucy Coleman. And they both indicate that Lincoln treated Sojourner Truth with respect in that meeting. And Sojourner Truth said, I felt I was in the presence of a friend when she reflected on what that meeting had been like. For the question about auntie, that I've gotten that question before, and it's a good one. There's an African-American scholar named Margaret Washington who argues that Lincoln using that word is similar to soldiers calling William Sherman Uncle Billy, or Lincoln Uncle Abe, or Confederate soldiers calling Robert E. Lee Marse Robert. That there was something in the culture where it wasn't meant in the pejorative way. Now, Lucy Coleman in 1891 said it was pejorative, and that's how she remembered it. But Dr. Washington makes this argument that looking at it within the context of the time, it was not uncommon for folks to use that sort of appellation. And again, relying on Sojourner Truth's earliest recollections, she did not seem at all put off or offended in her interaction with Lincoln. She, for years, would tell people about what it was like to meet Lincoln. And Sojourner Truth, of all people, knew when she was being insulted by white people. Her mistress, when Sojourner Truth, when she runs away a year before becoming free in 1826, her son is still in bondage in New York. And she goes back to try to save her son, and her mistress says, what does it matter to you? You have plenty of children. Why does this one matter? You'll get by. And when Sojourner Truth talked to white audiences, she was vilified and harassed and mocked and heckled. Sojourner Truth, of all people, knew what it was like to be mistreated by white people, whether in an individual audience or in a public place. And I don't think that was her experience with Lincoln. She had a very different experience with Lincoln.
Okay, we have a question
Yeah.
coming in from our audience, and it says Lincoln recognized Haiti and Liberia as nations. Did he ever meet with diplomats from those places?
Yeah, there's no firsthand account of Lincoln meeting with the diplomat from Haiti, Ernest Romaine. When Romaine came into Washington in February of 1863, he was welcomed into the sort of diplomatic circles. We know that Romaine went to the White House for various functions, and so it is very likely that Romaine met Lincoln at some of those functions. Cabinet officials invited Romaine to dinner, and so he met Seward, Secretary of State, and Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury. But within Washington circles as a whole, the ambassador encountered a lot of racial prejudice. And so by the end of the year, he decided he was going to go to a more metropolitan place where he would be treated better. And so he relocated to New York City. So, yeah, we know that he was in D.C. He almost certainly met with Lincoln, but there's no firsthand eyewitness accounts of it.
Yeah, there was certainly a great deal of debate about whether or not who these new nations should send as their representatives. And Lincoln famously said, apparently, that he shan't tear his shirt if a N-word, showed up as the representative.
Well, so can I, to that point, that quote actually comes from October of 1862, I think, in a Boston newspaper.
Mhm.
And the original quote is not the N-word. The original quote is the word Negro, but it evolved over time and now is often quoted as the N-word. But that's the earliest source is not that.
Okay. Okay. One last question.
Sure.
You mentioned that the letters that African Americans send to Lincoln reveal that they have a great deal of respect for him, and that they are expecting certain things from him, freedom and equality being two of those. How do they, in terms of the letters themselves,
Yeah.
how are they defining equality at this point?
Oh, that's a great question. They define it in a number of ways. Some of it is financial. They want equal pay. So many Black soldiers and their wives write to Lincoln, "We deserve equal pay. The bullets don't discriminate on account of skin color." Some write to Lincoln again about land. Some write to Lincoln because Northern speculators are moving into the Confederacy and they are buying up the land that has been abandoned by the former planters, and they're then able to gouge the freed people. And so they write to Lincoln calling for equal treatment in how they're interacting with the federal government and having to interact with land speculators. And again, some of them write for the right to vote. They want political equality and the right to vote, just as a white man would have at that time. And so I think it has to do with politics and financial aspects. There are some probably pushes for social equality, but those are not as pronounced. I think in that moment, with Black men serving and sacrificing on the battlefield, there's a widespread belief among Americans in that era that people who serve on the battlefield deserve the rights of citizenship. And so I think that's primarily what they're pushing for.
I'm so struck by the diversity of letters, and especially the letters that are coming from mothers, begging for something to occur with their sons, either let them out of the army or make sure that they get enough pay that they can send some money home. I mean, the interesting thing was that Black women and the families of Black men did not have the kind of support. These soldiers did not have the kind of support that others did.
And I want to thank you, Edna. You read the book in manuscript 6 years ago and gave me wonderful feedback. And thank you for writing the foreword to the book. I'm very grateful.
My pleasure. We do have another question, but I think we're out of time. So we will dismiss you so you can get to your next appointment.
Thank you.
Professor White, thank you so much for a stimulating discussion. And please, everyone, stand by. I'm going to turn the program over now back to Professor Michelle Kroll.
Thank you, Edna. The Abraham Lincoln Institute respects the commitment and talent required for significant research and presentation in dissertations and books. We will hear later in the program from this year's ALI Book Award recipient, Michael Burlingame. The Hay Nicolay Dissertation Prize, awarded annually by the Abraham Lincoln Institute and the Abraham Lincoln Association, recognizes recent PhDs who produce notable dissertations related to the life, times, and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. The 2022 Hay Nicolay Prize was awarded to Dr. Scott Ackerman for his dissertation, "We Are Abolitionizing the West, the Union Army and the Implementation of Federal Emancipation Policy, 1861 to 1865. Dr. Ackerman completed his dissertation in 2019 at the City University of New York, where he studied under Professor James Oakes. Dr. Ackerman now teaches at Germanna Community College in Virginia. Here to accept the Hay Nicolay Dissertation Prize and to say a few words about his dissertation research is Dr. Scott Ackerman.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored and humbled to be the recipient of the 2022 Hay Nicolay Dissertation Prize. My deepest thanks to the selection committee of the Abraham Lincoln Association and the Abraham Lincoln Institute for the recognition of my work, and my thanks as well to Ford's Theater for putting together today's program. In many ways, this is a full circle moment for me. I started my career in history as a historical interpreter at President Lincoln's Cottage in DC. Many of the questions that informed my project first came out of questions about the Lincoln presidency at that site. And so I'll give a quick overview of my work and then a couple of people to thank at the end of it. So. Thanks to the fine work of many previous historians, some of whom are represented here today, we have a reasonably clear picture of how the actions of enslaved persons, as well as the Union armies, combined to destroy slavery on the ground in the Confederacy. We also have a solid understanding of what federal emancipation policy entailed and how that policy developed. What we lack is a clear picture of how emancipation policy related to the process of emancipation on the ground. My work ties high policy with social conditions on the ground by examining the careers of Union Army officers whom I call the middle managers of emancipation policy. These are often overlooked figures like Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas, Major George Stearns, Captain Reuben Musey, Colonel James Brisbane, Major General Nathaniel Banks, among others, who are all charged by the War Department with superintending the process of emancipation. And it's their unique positions within the Union Army that allow us to connect the emancipation policies that came from Washington to their implementation on the ground in the Confederacy. And framing the project around those officers allows us to move beyond the narratives of emancipation that tend to focus either on Lincoln or on the actions of the Union Army and enslaved persons on the ground. So in short, these Union officers offer us really the best vantage point to explain that relationship between emancipation policy and practice. And my work concentrates almost exclusively on the Western theater. We see a lot of work on military emancipation being done on the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Virginia, but much work does remain to be done on the Western theater. And using that Western theater-wide focus allows us to compare and contrast continuities and in policy implementation across different departments and armies, while also allowing for those important variations on the ground. And perhaps most importantly for the focus on the Western theater, it affords examples of the way that the development of free labor systems and humanitarian care, or lack thereof, for Black refugees comprised an integral component of military emancipation. And In general, scholars who work on military emancipation tend to focus on how commanding officers or enlisted soldiers handled questions surrounding the freeing of enslaved persons, while historians who study free labor sometimes give short shrift to the importance of military movements and the importance of military emancipation. And these observations sound kind of simplistic, but Union Army officers were acutely aware of the intricate relationship between military emancipation, free labor plantations, and humanitarian care for Black refugees, viewing each as different sides of the same coin. And so a particular focus of my study is that relationship between Union Army grand strategy, military emancipation, the development of free labor plantations, and humanitarian care for Black refugees. So with that short overview, I hope my book editor's happy I managed to get it in under 5 minutes. I just have a couple quick people that I need to thank. So in closing, I need to single out my dissertation advisor, Jim Oakes, whose insistence that we haven't gotten the war right became a sort of guiding light for my own work. And when I say that Jim demands that his students ask big questions, what I mean is that when I told him my project was becoming a new history of emancipation, he simply responded, "Good." I'm not sure if I should really be thanking him for that. But finally, and most importantly, are my parents, who are somewhere out there in Zoom land, and whom, when I told that I would be speaking really for only 5 minutes and it was not necessary for them to attend, they said, "We understand, but where's the link so that we can attend?" So thanks, Mom and Dad. And thank you to the Abraham Lincoln Association and the Abraham Lincoln Institute for having me here today.
Thank you, Dr. Ackerman, and congratulations again on your award. The ALI is pleased to announce that it recently instituted a new scholarship to assist PhD students just starting dissertations in Lincoln Studies. For more information about both the Hay Nicolay Dissertation Prize and the new ALI Scholarship Award, please visit the ALI website at www.lincoln-institute.org. The Abraham Lincoln Institute also bestows a Legacy Award in recognition of extraordinary contributions to the field of Lincoln Studies. Past recipients have included Cullum Davis, Rodney O. Davis, William C. Harris, Lewis Lehrman, Wayne C. Temple, and Douglas Wilson. The recipient of the 2022 Abraham Lincoln Institute Legacy Award is the Kunhardt family. As the title of their 2015 film, Living with Lincoln, suggests, generations of the Meserve and Kunhardt families have lived with Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War through their extraordinary archive of photographic, printed, and three-dimensional materials. First begun in the 1890s by Frederick Hill Meserve, the Meserve Kunhardt collection has inspired numerous books, articles, exhibits, films, and artistic works on Abraham Lincoln. Thus, thanks to the Kunhardt family and its collection, we also continue to live with Lincoln. To accept the ALI Legacy Award on behalf of his family, we welcome Philip Kunhardt.
Thank you for those kind remarks, Michelle. And thank you to the entire group of the Abraham Lincoln Institute. Having served as historical consultant on my brother's newest film, Lincoln's Dilemma, I feel that I already know your Vice President, Edna Green Medford, one of my favorite scholars linked to that series. Over the years, I've come to know many of the historians associated with and honored by the ALI, including today's honoree, the amazingly prolific Michael Burlingame. Congratulations, Michael. Over the years, I've worked closely with Eric Foner, with Douglas Wilson, James Oakes, and Doris Kearns Goodwin, among others. And I'm delighted to be here today to say thank you. I grew up in what you might call a Lincoln family. My great-grandfather, who I knew as a boy, was Frederick Hill Meserve, and his daughter, who inherited his vast photography collection, was Dorothy Meserve Kunhardt. She and her father forged an intergenerational partnership that became the model of 5 generations of this family. In 1965, she and my father co-authored the book 20 Days that combined a photojournalistic approach with vivid narrative storytelling. Years later, when my father decided to write his book, Lincoln at Gettysburg, A New Birth of Freedom, he asked me to become his research assistant and to help write 2 of the chapters. Later still, he and my brother Peter and I formed a family triumvirate that lasted from 1991 to our father's death in 2006. During that period, we wrote and produced a 4-hour documentary on Lincoln for ABC Primetime, co-authored 3 published books, and became the stewards of the Meserve Kunhardt collection. After our father was gone, my brother and I joined forces with his son Peter to write the book Looking for Lincoln, a companion to a PBS documentary by the same name, and also to our 1992 illustrated biography of Lincoln. And after I moved on to a professorship at NYU, where I taught courses on Lincoln and on Frederick Douglass, Peter went on to produce the film that Michelle mentioned earlier called Living with Lincoln, a work our family is immensely proud of. During these years, Peter and his son, Peter Jr., and I teamed up to write and edit a capstone book of ours on the photographs of Abraham Lincoln. And then, soon to appear, a published retrospective on the legacy of our grandmother, in which one of the chapters focused on her life with Lincoln. And most recently, Peter, along with his sons Teddy and George, oversaw the extraordinary team that wrote and produced the film series, Lincoln's Dilemma. My life has been blessed to be part of so much scholarship and storytelling, and so much opportunity for archival research in the Meserve Kunhardt collection. After years of seeking a permanent home for the collection, we are proud that it now resides at Yale University's Beinecke Library. Thank you again for this legacy award to the Kunhardt family. I'm proud to accept it on behalf of 5 generations of Meserves and Kunhardts who dedicated much of their lives to a better and more public understanding of the human being who, in concert with a myriad of important actors, both free and enslaved, stood at the center of America's most terrible and important trial.
And congratulations again on the Legacy Award. Our second distinguished speaker today is Dr. Christopher Bonner. Professor Bonner specializes in African American history and the 19th century United States. Originally from Chesapeake, Virginia, he earned his BA from Howard University, his PhD from Yale University, and now teaches in the Department of History at the University of Maryland, College Park. In March 2020, he published his first book, Remaking the Republic: Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship, which centers free Black Americans in the legal transformations of the United States during the mid-19th century. He is the author of essays published in several edited collections, and his work also appears in digital form at Muster, the blog of the Journal of the Civil War Era, and at Black Perspectives, the blog for the African American Intellectual History Society, to which he was a regular contributor from 2014 to 2016. Professor Bonner is currently at work on a project considering how enslaved people navigated commercial networks as they sought to purchase freedom in the early 19th century. But today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Christopher Bonner to the program for But for Your Race Among Us, Making Sense of Lincoln and Colonization.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for that kind introduction. Thanks for inviting me to take part in this event. It's very cool to be able to share some of my work, some of my thoughts with you about such an important historical figure. And thanks everybody behind the scenes for making this whole thing happen. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and talk about Lincoln. I wonder how it felt when he told them to leave. When he said their home was not their own, when he blamed their people enslaved for a rebellion that had killed tens of thousands. When he urged those 5 Black men to spread his message, calling on others to move to Liberia, Central America, or anywhere but here. A part of me would love the chance to ask these questions of the men who met with Abraham Lincoln at the White House in 1862. But another part of me is comforted by the fact that I can never truly know their feelings in that moment. It was August 14th, almost certainly a steamy day, and they came to the White House at the invitation of Lincoln's appointed Commissioner of Immigration. The members of the delegation sat before a president who many enslaved people had already come to see as a potential source of their liberation. Lincoln spoke, and they listened. He told them Congress had designated a sum of money for the project of colonization, removing African Americans from the United States and resettling them elsewhere. Because of that congressional action, Lincoln said he felt a responsibility to support the project, though he was clear that it had for a long time been his inclination to favor that cause. Perhaps the men wondered why Lincoln was such a decided supporter of colonization. Or maybe they hoped to have a conversation about the merits of various proposals. But Lincoln anticipated their hesitancy, and he came prepared with arguments he thought would put the question beyond debate. "I do not propose to discuss this," the president said at one point. They heard him say that Black and white people were fundamentally different. Because of that difference, he said, "Your race suffer very greatly, many of them by living among us, while ours suffer from your presence." They listened while Lincoln said slavery was the greatest wrong people could endure, but that Black equality in the United States was unfathomable. They heard the president's argument that Black Americans who opposed colonization because they feared they could not make a home in a foreign country held an extremely selfish view of the case. They surely noticed that Lincoln seemed to misplace responsibility for the country's problems. "But for your race among us, there could not be war," the president declared. But the delegates could not mistake his interpretation of the civil cataclysm. "I repeat," he said, "without the institution of slavery and the colored race as a basis, the war could not have an existence." The existence of African Americans had caused the Civil War. Surely, all could see the logic in removing that problem population. This is a foundational moment for understanding the intersection of Lincoln and African American history. I'd like to talk today about the context for this moment and to think about that context from 2 different angles. First, what was it that led Lincoln to believe this was a good idea? How did Lincoln come to think that blaming the war on Black Americans and urging them, therefore, to leave the country could be a proper or effective approach? The second thing I'd like to consider is the context for the development of Lincoln's thinking. How did he move from this vision of African Americans as a problem to his final partial endorsement of their belonging? So 2 broad questions frame my remarks. Why did Lincoln support colonization, and why did he change? Black activists stand at the center of answers to both of these questions. In the early 19th century, when free African Americans insisted they should be free and equal in the United States, they made themselves a problem population in the minds of many white folks. Colonizationists saw that Black people would not accept unequal belonging, which made them feel a more urgent need for Black removal. During the Civil War, when African Americans insisted they should bear arms, that their service should be repaid with equality, and that the president should hear their concerns, they reshaped Lincoln's ideas and policies regarding Black belonging. Maybe some part of Lincoln understood the importance of Black politics in these transformations. The phrase he chose, "but for your race among us," was richly layered with meanings. Black people's presence in the United States and their tenacious demands for belonging led many white Americans to insist that that belonging was impossible. But ultimately, the same tenacity led Lincoln to see that African Americans could be rights-bearing members of the community. This is a story about a man and his nation remade by African American politics. So first, what led Lincoln to think colonization could be a good or viable project? In 1816, an odd coalition of American men met in Washington, D.C. to establish the American Colonization Society. This would be the leading national organization pursuing the removal and resettlement of Black Americans. The ACS sought government funding, bought ships and supplies, identified places outside the U.S. where African Americans could be sent, and transported them to those new homes, focusing their work on Liberia, a colony on the West African coast. The ACS appealed to many anti-slavery Americans who believed slave owners were reluctant to free their slaves because they were afraid to live alongside freed men and women. So maybe if colonization could provide an outlet for the emancipated, then the country might soon be cleansed of the sin of slavery. These folks disregarded the evidence that most slave owners had no thoughts of liberating valuable human property. In fact, some slave-owning Southerners embraced colonization because they were convinced free African Americans endangered slavery. If enslaved people saw Black freedom was a possibility, they might become unwilling to comply with an owner's commands. Or worse, they might rebel in an effort to make themselves free. Enslaved people, of course, didn't need to see Black freedom in order to want it for themselves. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the colonization movement is the support it garnered from centers of formal power. Among the earliest members of the ACS were John Randolph, a descendant of wealthy slave owners and a congressman from Virginia, Bushrod Washington, who was George Washington's nephew and a U.S. Supreme Court justice, and Henry Clay, who was at various points a senator from Kentucky, Speaker of the House, Secretary of State, and frequent failed presidential candidate. This support was structural, not solely individual. The federal government provided more than 1/3 of all the funds the ACS received in the years before the Civil War. On the state level, lawmakers put Maryland, which had a large and growing free Black population, on the movement's leading edge. Marylanders organized a colony within a colony, Maryland in Liberia. The state legislature agreed to dedicate $10,000 from each year's budget to support colonization. So the ideas of the ACS moved through spaces of real government power in the United States. Abraham Lincoln was far from the only influential person who embraced some aspects of colonization. Advocates for colonization united in an effort to realize a vision of the United States as a white man's republic. From the beginning, Black people pushed back against this exclusionary American dream. In January 1817, just months after the ACS was founded, hundreds of Black Philadelphians dismissed its central argument. How could colonization be an anti-slavery project if it removed free Black people from the nation, given that free Black people were the driving force of abolitionism? We will never separate ourselves voluntarily from the slave population in this country, the Philadelphians said. They are our brethren. As the colonization movement persisted into the Antebellum period, African Americans recognized that the ideas underlying the ACS were connected to many other aspects of racial inequality. This included measures to restrict Black movement within the United States. Ohio laws required African Americans to pay a $500 bond before they settled in the state. When Pennsylvania tried to enact a law that would bar new Black settlers, activists reminded legislators of the nation's principles, noting that Black as well as white men were born equally free and independent. The measure in Pennsylvania failed, but that state did join others in denying Black men the vote in 1838. That was a political reflection of a broader Black exclusion. In the face of these actions, African Americans combined their demands for specific rights with an insistence that they belonged in the United States. In 1839, Black newspaper editor Samuel Cornish worried that the nation was imperiled, its principles corrupted by white supremacy. Cornish questioned whether American democracy was truly better than European monarchies. The only difference here seemed to be that the few contend to obtain their rights from the many who withhold them. Cornish felt responsible for ensuring the nation did not continue its slide into corruption. In a republic, he wrote, all on whom God has stamped his image have an equal right to an equal participation in their common government. And Cornish urged other African Americans to remain steadfast in their dedication to their native country. We are not temporary sojourners in a foreign land, nor aliens seeking citizenship, nor slaves begging for liberty. No, we are an integral portion of this republic. For Cornish, part of what made him and other African Americans so integral to the United States was that they were the ones who were advocating for the nation to embody its founding ideals, its founding principles. So African Americans also argued that the nation would not exist without their contributions in the wars that created and preserved the nation. Black men's bones have enriched the most productive lands of our country, they declared. The nation's liberties and privileges were purchased by the exertions and blood of our fathers. How could this be a white man's republic when Black people had done so much to make the nation? The United States was their home, and that home had been made livable by their own strivings. Occasionally, prominent Black activists announced their support for colonization, as the newspaper editor John Russwurm did in 1829. Russwurm settled in Liberia and eventually rose to be the first Black governor of the Maryland colony in West Africa. But his choices made him a villain from the perspective of other African Americans. Mr. Russwurm tells us he knows no other home for us than Africa, one Black Philadelphian noted. As his usefulness is entirely lost to the people, I sincerely pray that he may have the honor to live and also die there. By the late 1830s, colonization had begun to fall out of favor among many elected officials, but it persisted as a movement. It was buoyed by a pervasive fear of Black people. We cannot understand that fear without understanding the radicalism of African American politics. People who supported colonization didn't believe in Black equality, but activists made it clear again and again that most of them would accept neither inequality nor removal. Sometimes they expressed those feelings violently. In April 1837, a crowd of 1,000 Black people gathered outside of New York's City Hall to fight for a Black man named William Dixon. Dixon had been arrested a few days earlier, charged with being a fugitive slave who had escaped from Baltimore. After a hearing, New York officials, sheriffs in particular, sheriffs tried to escort William Dixon out of City Hall and take him back to his jail. But the crowd attacked in an effort to liberate this alleged fugitive. Several people hit the sheriffs with wooden clubs. A Black woman who was standing in the front of the crowd pulled a knife from under her dress and handed it to Dixon, urging him to run. While he did, the crowd struggled with the authorities, including a judge who ran out to try to help the sheriffs. Dixon was soon recaptured and his trial resumed, but the New Yorkers had made their point. Attacking sheriffs and judges in order to liberate an alleged fugitive was a protest against the possibility that a free Black man could legally be sent into bondage. Denied the right to vote, these New Yorkers took to the streets to express their disdain for the existing legal order. The stridency of African Americans' demands and the disorder they could create in public spaces must have intensified white anxieties about Black freedom. An observer of these events, conditioned by the country's racial order, might conclude that Black people themselves were the problem. They might come to think that removing African Americans was a straightforward solution to the tensions that plagued the nation in the antebellum decades. Such an observer might say to Black people, as Lincoln did in 1862, "It is better for us both to be separated." Even if colonization did not thrive as a government program in the pre-war years, the ideology was shaped and sharpened by African American opposition. The colonization movement that Abraham Lincoln encountered in his early political career was, in part, a product of Black politics. Lincoln debuted his public advocacy for colonization in the early 1850s. As the question of slavery's expansion radicalized and polarized many, he might have grasped onto colonization because he saw it as a moderate position. His belief that Black people should be freed and sent away stood firmly between the ideas that Black people should be either perpetually enslaved or that they should be liberated and made political equals. In 1852, Lincoln eulogized Henry Clay, and he celebrated Clay's ideas about the value of the ACS. Clay had said, "There is a moral fitness in the idea of returning to Africa her children." Lincoln dreamed that colonization might free America from slavery, and he said, "Restore a captive people to their long-lost fatherland." Best of all, colonization would implement these massive changes so gradually that neither races nor individuals shall have suffered by the change. For Lincoln, colonization was a welcome blend of moderate politics, moral opposition to slavery, and a conviction that Black people simply could not belong. Lincoln's interest in colonization shows us that there was a significant distance between opposing slavery and supporting racial equality in the antebellum United States. Lincoln had said persistently, and as early as the 1840s, if not earlier, persistently that he was opposed to slavery. Part of that opposition was about his desire to preserve access to land for white farmers, but it was also about his understanding that slavery was a brutal, horrific system. Still, even as he argued that white and Black people were humans, he was reluctant to embrace the idea that the two racial groups were entitled to an equal place in the nation. Lincoln was far from alone in these beliefs. In addition, Lincoln's long-standing support for colonization suggests a hard truth about antebellum American politics. Most powerful white Americans were not listening to Black activists. For decades, African Americans made it clear that most of them did not favor colonization, and they offered forceful arguments to show that the plan was both unpopular and immoral. For Lincoln to frame colonization as a reunion of African Americans with their fatherland suggests that he was either unaware of or unconcerned with the central dimensions of Black politics. Here again, Lincoln was far from alone. As president, Lincoln connected his formal power with his personal interest in colonization. He helped bring colonization back into conversation within the federal government. In a message to Congress from December 1861, he asked legislators to provide funds for colonization and to explore the options for acquiring land for the purpose. In September 1862, he authorized funds to purchase a plot of land in Central America. He was convinced, it seems, that a settlement in the Western Hemisphere might be more appealing to African Americans than a settlement in Africa. Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation called for further congressional planning regarding colonization. And in 1863, while emancipation and Black enlistment proceeded, Lincoln authorized colonization advocates to go into refugee camps in Virginia and to try to find out whether Black people who had fled slavery would be willing to leave the country. All of this was surely troubling for many Black Americans. Lincoln's interest in colonization reflected a larger set of circumstances that made some Black people have doubts about their futures. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 imperiled Black freedom. It led some runaways to seek a more secure liberty by resettling in Canada. Roger Taney's assertion in the Dred Scott case that Black people had never been rights-bearing Americans fueled concerns about the possibility of federal support for their claims to equality. In 1858, Henry Highland Garnett, who was a longtime advocate for Black rights in the US, established his own ACS. This is what he called the African Civilization Society. Garnett's group, his African Civilization Society, was designed to pursue missionary work in West Africa, and he thought of it as an emotionally fulfilling project for Black Americans in the wake of Dred Scott. In promotional literature for the society, Garnett declared his love for Africa, which he called the land of his ancestors. And Garnett also said individuals who chose to emigrate would help to build a Christian nation, and they would improve the continent as a whole. Garnett acknowledged that a lot of his thinking about his ACS was rooted in developments in the US. He felt disheartened by the laws of his native country, and he said that he hoped to see a national flag yet, of which he would be proud. In the winter of 1860 and 1861, while the nation waited to see whether secession would produce a war, Frederick Douglass considered his future as well. He planned a trip to Haiti, hoping to investigate the possibility of establishing a community for Black Americans in that island nation. Haiti was a Black republic born out of a slave rebellion, and so it had profound symbolic significance for African Americans. But this was still a major departure for a person who had been so clear for so long about his attachment to the United States. Ultimately, Douglass did not go. Rebel South Carolinians fired on US troops in Fort Sumter, beginning the Civil War and leading Douglass to find a renewed optimism. In a sense, the hope that Douglass and others invested in President Lincoln was only partly about the man. It was largely rooted in their interpretation of the war itself. Defeating a slave owner's rebellion, it seemed, must surely end slavery, and it might also transform the racial order of the nation. Black people made the Civil War a moment of opportunity. In early 1861, Black men, women, and children ran away from slave owners in southeastern Virginia, seeking refuge with the US Army and pushing the military to enact policies that would determine the status of these fugitives. Black men walked into recruitment offices and were turned away for 2 years. Still, in 1863, they enlisted in massive numbers when the US military finally welcomed them. They did so because they believed in the transformative possibilities of the war. "This is our golden moment," one recruitment poster shouted to Black Northerners. "Fail now and our race is doomed." Military service offered firmer ground for the political claims they had made for decades. In Baltimore, one Black minister met with state lawmakers and pushed for a broad set of rights. He informed these officials that the colored man of Maryland wants free soil, free speech, free men, and no slaves, with equal pay, equal bounty, equal pensions, equal rights, equal privileges, and equal suffrage. Black military sacrifice became a tool that furthered African Americans' demands for political access on the home front after the war's anticipated end. Lincoln's public cause of colonization faded as the Civil War progressed. He and others in positions of power came to see the possibility that Black people could be Americans. This development reflected one of the critical changes of the Civil War era, the emergence of a relationship between African Americans and the federal government. And here I want to try to develop some more of what we heard about in the first session today. A relationship developed between African Americans and the federal government during the Civil War. African Americans made that relationship. In so doing, they compelled Lincoln's turn away from public advocacy for colonization. Despite his persistence, Lincoln came to recognize Black people as Americans. They would have had it no other way. In July 1863, a Black woman named Hannah Johnson wrote a letter to President Lincoln. Johnson's son had gone to war in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and she was concerned about the Confederate threat that Black soldiers captured in battle would be treated as slaves in rebellion. As we heard, this could lead to enslaved people, this could lead to Black soldiers being either sold into slavery or executed. Hannah Johnson insisted on equality. She demanded that Lincoln see that the colored men fighting now are fairly treated. She also spoke more broadly about her views on African Americans' place in the conflict and in the nation. "I know it is right," Johnson wrote, "that a colored man ought to fight for his country, and so ought a white man. It's tough to know what Lincoln could have done to address Johnson's concerns. But what I find so fascinating about this letter is the choice that she made to send it. Hannah Johnson crafted this letter as an American mother demanding that an American president protect her American son. She assumed that Lincoln should care about Black people. So I read this letter as a performance of her belonging. If Lincoln still harbored doubts about an African American future, Johnson seemed to say, let him see that Black people do not. And if Lincoln were to live up to his reputation, he needed to show the same concern for Black people that they did for the United States. A just man must do hard things sometimes that show him to be a great man. In what became his final public remarks, Lincoln said that as Reconstruction began, certain Black men should have the right to vote. He spoke specifically of the very intelligent and those who serve our cause as soldiers. We cannot discount the massive personal transformation this represents. Having so long thought that colonization and emancipation must happen together, Lincoln now suggested that Black men voting would be important for remaking the Republic. We also cannot overlook the labor African American activists did to make this change. The many tools of Black protest deployed over the course of decades through a series of national crises brought Lincoln to his belated partial acknowledgement that African Americans were entitled to rights. The last thing I'll say here is about sort of how I think about this story in relation to some contemporary questions and concerns. Part of what fascinates me about this intersection between Lincoln and the colonization movement is that this is not simply about the 19th century. Lincoln's embrace of colonization reflects a deeply embedded and persistent thread in American thinking. The belief that the United States is a white man's republic is still with us in much of our politics, law, and culture. Thinking about what Lincoln means for us, I would like to include by encouraging us to be introspective. Perhaps we should consider how any of us, intentionally or not, might contribute to an exclusionary image of the United States or exclusionary practices in the United States. I'd like to hope that by thinking hard about ourselves and our choices, we can take steps toward eradicating a racialized view of the country. Still, I can't overlook the fact that even a person as great as Abraham Lincoln could never fully escape his own exclusionary beliefs. I will stop there and thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Professor Bonner. We look forward to further discussion with you in the Q&A segment at the end of the program. Our final speaker today, Dr. Michael Burlingame, likely needs no introduction to longtime ALI audience members. A graduate of Princeton and Johns Hopkins Universities, Professor Burlingame taught at Connecticut College for many years before joining the faculty at the University of Illinois Springfield in 2009, where he currently holds the Chancellor Naomi B. Lynn Distinguished Chair in Lincoln Studies. Professor Burlingame is the author of Abraham Lincoln, A Life, or as he calls it, The Green Monster, The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, An American Marriage, The Untold Story of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd, and Lincoln and the Civil War. He is also the editor of many collections of Lincoln primary source materials. The Atlantic rated Abraham Lincoln, A Life one of the 5 best books of the year 2009. And in the New York Review of Books, the Dean of Civil War Historians, James McPherson, wrote that Professor Burlingame knows more about Lincoln than any other living person. Professor Burlingame's presentation today is based on his recent book, The Black Man's President, Abraham Lincoln, African Americans, and the Pursuit of Racial Equality, for which he is the recipient of this year's Abraham Lincoln Institute Book Award. Congratulations on your award, Michael, and welcome to the virtual stage.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Michelle. And thank you, too, for the organization for inviting me to speak. I relish every opportunity I can get to speak about my favorite subject without having to grade any of the auditor's exams or papers. So And I'm also deeply grateful to the organization for the book prize, particularly since there were so many fine Lincoln books published last year, including books by Diana Schaub, Ron White, particularly Jim Oakes, Michael Green, several very fine books that were added to the literature. And so it's especially gratifying that my book was chosen. So now my book consists of overlaps with Jonathan White's to some extent. One of the differences between my book and Jonathan's is that I talk about not just Lincoln's visitors to the people who came to Lincoln's White House, Black people who came to the Lincoln White House, but also Lincoln's relationship with Black people in Springfield. And then I have a section of the book in which I deal with the kind of criticism of Lincoln that many have made over the years about his lack of racial understanding and openness. So without further ado, what I would like to do is to focus primarily on that latter section. So without further ado, I will get underway. Now, in his recent cultural biography of Lincoln, David S. Reynolds cogently argued that only by examining Lincoln's personal interchange with Black people are we able to see the complete falsity of the charges of innate racism that some have leveled against him. Most of my book describes, as I mentioned, the many encounters Lincoln had with African Americans in both Springfield and Washington, implicitly bolstering Reynolds' argument. My book also contains a section devoted to assessing those charges of innate racism, charges that I would like to address today. Critics of Lincoln's racial views, among them Henry Louis Gates, cite several things to make their case, notably an 1877 statement by Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, who claimed that the 16th president, quote, doubted if Africans as a race were themselves capable of organizing as a community and successfully maintaining a government without supervision, or were individually susceptible of high intellectual cultivation. There might be and were exceptional cases, but they, that is, most African Americans, were by nature dull, inert, dependent, and of little foresight, an ignorant and inferior race who needed to be governed and were not as a class able or qualified to participate intelligently in self-government. If they were to exercise the high privilege of suffrage, it must be at some distant day in the future after several generations of education and nurture. Well, this summary of Lincoln's thinking demonstrably misrepresented Lincoln's racial views, describing his own, that is, Wells' own opinion to the president. 5 months after Lincoln's assassination, Wells wrote in his diary, "I would not enslave the Negro, but his enfranchisement is another question altogether. And until he is better informed, it is not desirable that he should vote." Wells added, "I am no advocate of social equality, nor do I labor for political or civil equality with a Negro. I do not want him at my table. I do not care to have him in the jury box or in the legislative hall or on the bench." Now, Pache Wells, Lincoln did not believe that voting rights for African Americans should be delayed until some distant day in the future. As Wells knew, on April 11th, 1865, the president, for the first time, publicly endorsed Black voting rights, and 3 days later was murdered for having done so. To be sure, Lincoln recommended that only African Americans who had served in the armed forces and those who were very intelligent, presumably he meant literate, should be enfranchised. But in making that announcement, he was laying the groundwork for unrestricted voting rights for all Black men, as Frederick Douglass acknowledged in a little-known December 1865 speech. On that occasion, Douglass remarked that Lincoln's support for only limited Black suffrage disappointed him at first because of its limited scope. And it seemed to mean but little, as Douglass said. But Douglass soon realized that it actually, as he put it, meant a great deal. He went on to say, It was just like Abraham Lincoln. He never shocked prejudices unnecessarily. Having learned statesmanship while splitting rails, he always used the thin edge of the wedge first, and the fact that he used it at all meant that he would, if need be, use the thick edge as well as the thin. In 1864, Lincoln had begun dealing with the issue of Black suffrage. In March of that year, he inserted the thin edge of the wedge by privately urging Louisiana's governor, as Jonathan White pointed out earlier today, to support the enfranchisement of Blacks who served in the military or who were intelligent, i.e. literate. In the following spring and summer, Lincoln worked behind the scenes to persuade the Louisiana Constitutional Convention to do so. In April '65, he drove the wedge deeper by publicly endorsing the same policy. If he had not been killed for doing so, he probably would have driven home the thick edge of the wedge by urging that all Black adult males be enfranchised. Did Lincoln really believe, as Gideon Wells alleged, that most Blacks were by nature dull, inert, dependent, and of little foresight, thus constituting an ignorant and inferior race? No, Lincoln never said Blacks were inferior to whites in any respect, save in terms of color, which was probably a satirical concession designed to make white supremacists look ridiculous. What, after all, is an inferior color? On July 17, 1858, he told a Springfield audience, "Certainly the Negro is not our equal in color, perhaps not in many other respects. Still, in the right to put into his mouth the bread that his own hands have earned, he is the equal of every other man, white or Black." As David Reynolds observed, Lincoln cunningly surrounded his racist sounding pronouncements with phrases that pointed in a radically abolitionist direction. By stating that Blacks were perhaps inferior intellectually and morally, he clearly implied that they were perhaps not inferior in those respects. A week earlier, Lincoln had publicly condemned racism at the outset of the Illinois senatorial campaign, one day after Stephen A. Douglass delivered a flagrantly racist speech in Chicago. In the conclusion of Lincoln's response to the senator's demagogic harangue, Lincoln urged his audience to, quote, "discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and that race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position." Instead of such quibbling, Lincoln said, "Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal." Speaking a few days later in Springfield, he asked his fellow townsmen rhetorically, "Who shall say I am the superior and you are the inferior?" The following year, Lincoln wrote a public letter ridiculing people who argued that the Declaration of Independence did not apply to all men, but only those men belonging to superior races, a phrase that he enclosed within quotation marks. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln recommended that the fugitive slave law be amended so that all the safeguards of liberty known in civilized and humane jurisprudence ought to be introduced so that a free man be not in any case surrendered as a slave. So what Lincoln was saying was that Blacks accused of being runaway slaves should be allowed a jury trial, the right to counsel, the right to testify on their own behalf, the right to appeal a conviction, and the other safeguards enshrined in the Bill of Rights. Lincoln then went a step further, saying, "And might it not be well at the same time to provide by law for the enforcement of that clause in the Constitution, which guarantees that the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states? In other words, that free Blacks in the North be accorded the same rights as white people in each state." In 1863, Lincoln told a working man's group in New York, alluding to the draft riots of a few months earlier, during which some Blacks were lynched, and he said, "None are so deeply interested to resist the present rebellion as the working people. Let them beware of prejudice, working division and hostility among themselves. The most notable feature of a disturbance in your city last summer was the hanging of some working people by other working people. It should never be so. The strongest bond of human sympathy outside of the family relation should be one uniting all working people of all nations and tongues and kindreds. By all, Lincoln meant both blacks and whites, as he told a Connecticut audience in 1860. I want every man to have the chance, and I believe a black man is entitled to it, in which he can better his condition. In private writings, as well as public pronouncements, Lincoln rejected racist arguments. Sometime during the 1850s, he penned an analysis of pro-slavery logic, warning those who justified enslaving people based on their skin color to take care. For by this rule, you are to be the slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. The best rebuttal to Gideon Wells's description of Lincoln's purported racism is the abundant evidence of Lincoln's racial egalitarianism manifested in his interactions with Black people, a subject covered extensively both in my book and Jonathan White's more recent volume, A House Built by Slaves, about which we heard earlier this afternoon. Also telling is Frederick Douglass's little-known June 1st, 1865 eulogy of Lincoln, in which the famed Black orator described Lincoln as emphatically the Black man's president, the first to show any respect for their rights as men, or to acknowledge that the Black man had any rights, which the white man ought to respect. Lincoln was, Frederick Douglass said, the first American president who rose above the prejudice of his times and his country. Now, in addition to Gideon Wells's analysis of Lincoln's alleged bigotry, critics of his racial views cite a different speech by Frederick Douglass, one he delivered in 1876 at the dedication of a sculpture group known as the Emancipation Monument, or the Freedmen's Memorial, in Washington. That oration was based largely on his 1865 eulogy, but with a few startling changes. In 1876, he declared to the many African Americans in his large audience, Abraham Lincoln was not either our man or our model. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. What a contrast to emphatically the Black man's president, the first to show any respect for their rights as men. In 1876, Douglass contradicted other points that he had made in the 1865 eulogy. For example, in 1876, he said, President Lincoln was a white man who shared the prejudices common to his countrymen toward the colored race. But in 1865, Lincoln was described by Douglass as the first American president who rose above the prejudice of his time and his country, and was one of the very few white Americans who could converse with a Negro without anything like condescension and without in any wise reminding him of the unpopularity of his color. Another example, in 1876, Douglass said, looking back to his times and to the condition of his country, we are compelled to admit that this unfriendly feeling for Blacks on his part may be safely set down as one element of his wonderful success. But in 1865, Douglass recalled an episode that demonstrated Lincoln's, quote, kindly disposition towards colored people. In his 1876 oration, Douglass passed judgment on Lincoln's handling of slavery and racial issues. And he said this, viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. In subsequent addresses and writings, Douglass praised Lincoln without such a qualifier. In 1883, Douglass wrote, in all my interviews with Mr. Lincoln, I was impressed with his entire freedom from popular prejudice against the colored race. Douglass described the 16th president as, quote, a very great man, as great as the greatest, a man so broad in his sympathy, so noble in his character, so just in his action, so free from narrow prejudice, that all classes and conditions of men could claim him as a friend, a brother, and a benefactor. 5 years later, Douglass declared, "I have seen many great men, but I have met with no such man at home or abroad who made upon my mind the impression of possessing a more godlike nature than did Abraham Lincoln." Douglass added that, measuring Lincoln by the standard of human goodness and nobility of character, no better man than he has ever stood or walked upon the continent. So, you might ask, why did Douglass in 1876 portray Lincoln as the white man's president who shared the prejudices common to his countrymen towards the colored race and harbored unfriendly feelings for blacks? Douglass was evidently at that time aiming those remarks at the political elite of the day. That is to say, the president, members of his cabinet, congressional leaders, and Supreme Court justices who attended the ceremony dedicating the Emancipation Monument. In 1876, Douglass was in despair, for those powerful men had seemingly lost interest in protecting the rights of African Americans, rights that had been guaranteed in the 14th and 15th Amendments, both of which had been enforced rigorously for a time, but no longer. The subtext of the oration seemed to be this message to the power elite: don't abandon African Americans to the tender mercies of Southern whites, whose violent resistance to Reconstruction measures was erasing the gains that had begun with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and his public support of Black suffrage. The martyred president had championed emancipation and Black suffrage, not because he was a tender-minded do-gooder, but because he was a tough-minded realist, devoted to the interests of the white race, which he knew would benefit if the Black race enjoyed citizenship rights. Now, critics of Lincoln's racial views also point to the appeal he made in August 1862, as Professor Bonner mentioned, to 5 Black leaders of Washington's Black community, urging them to spearhead a colonization in Central America. That widely misinterpreted meeting, properly understood, was a strategic move by the president to help prepare the public mind to accept the Emancipation Proclamation, which he issued the following month. In addition, Lincoln believed that the government should help those African Americans who understandably lost any hope of achieving equality in the US, to help them to immigrate to an overseas haven where they could enjoy first-class citizenship. As historian James Oakes speculated, Lincoln's support for colonization probably had less to do with racism than with racial pessimism. That is, that Lincoln was pessimistic about the chances for Black people to enjoy first-class citizenship because of the depth and extent of white anti-Black prejudice. Critics of Lincoln also point to his statement opening one of the debates with Stephen A. Douglas in 1858, the one held in Charleston, Illinois, where he said, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and Black races. I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making jurors or voters of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and Black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Well, Lincoln was careful not to say that Blacks are inferior, but that since they cannot coexist with whites on terms of political and social equality, thanks to intractable white prejudice, he would prefer that they be placed in an inferior position. Now, as Donnie Fehrenbacher, a distinguished Lincoln scholar, noted, Lincoln supported racial separation, and I quote, on grounds of the incompatibility rather than the inequality of the races. At Charleston, Lincoln promptly qualified his stark avowal by saying, I do not perceive that because the white man is to have the superior position, the Negro should be denied everything. I do not understand that because I do not want a Negro woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. My understanding is that I can just let her alone. Now, what are we to make of the statement that Lincoln made at Charleston? To decide, we should follow the counsel of David Reynolds, who sensibly observed that Lincoln's attitudes toward race must be measured against those of the surrounding culture. Only then can we responsibly come to a conclusion about this crucial topic. Such a comparison shows that Lincoln's surrounding culture was awash in a sea, an ocean of Negrophobia. William Lee Miller suggested that to appraise Lincoln fairly, one should not compare him to unattached abolitionists in Massachusetts, or to anyone a century and a half later, but to other engaged politicians in the Old Northwest during the 1850s. Now, several of those politicians shared Lincoln's view on Black citizenship rights, but expressed much greater skepticism about racial equality than Lincoln ever did. Prime example is his old friend Joshua Giddings of Ohio, the leading anti-slavery champion in Congress. In 1859, he declared on the floor of the House of Representatives, "We do not say the black man is or shall be the equal of the white man, or that he shall vote or hold office." Several other anti-slavery champions voiced similar sentiments, among them Owen Lovejoy, Henry Wilson, Benjamin Wade, Lyman Trumbull, Theodore Parker, and many others. Compared to their statements, Lincoln's seem racially enlightened. In the 1850s, Lincoln was primarily concerned with ending slavery, which he considered a greater evil than the limitation placed on civil rights for free blacks. There were 4 million slaves and 226,000 free blacks in the North. And deplorable as second-class citizenship was, slavery was much more deplorable. While it might be possible to attack both of those evils simultaneously in antebellum New England, it was not then politically feasible either in Illinois or in the country at large. Racial equality was an issue which Lincoln was willing to soft pedal in order to win over the voters of Negrophobic Illinois in order to defeat Stephen A. Douglas, whom he considered the most dangerous ally of the slave power. Lincoln was unwilling to cede the 1858 election to the senator, which he would have done if he had openly opposed the prairie states' black laws, as Douglas dared him to do. Lincoln wanted to put slavery on the road to ultimate extinction, and to accept Stephen A. Douglas's invitation to denounce Illinois' Black Code would have been politically suicidal. As historian George Frederickson observed, it is clear that no one who did not at least pay lip service to white supremacy could get elected to a statewide office in Illinois. Most, if not all, of Lincoln's racist-sounding remarks merely paid such lip service. When asked to explain his public support for the Prairie State's anti-miscegenation statute, he replied in a private conversation, "That law means nothing. I shall never marry a negress, but I have no objection to anyone else doing so. If a white man wants to marry a Negro woman, let him do it, if the Negro woman can stand it." Though Lincoln bowed to political necessity in 1858, he reversed course during the Civil War by publicly endorsing Black voting rights and was promptly assassinated for doing so. To some critics of Lincoln's racial views, his sense of humor showed him to be a racist. Now, it is true that he affected an African-American dialect while telling jokes featuring Blacks, jokes that to modern ears seem at the very least insensitive, if not downright offensive. At the time, however, they were considered by polite society as no more unacceptable than good-natured jokes Lincoln made about thick, brogued Irishmen, or about Germans who pronounced the consonant W as if it were a V. Frederick Douglass is seldom condemned as a bigot for scornfully referring to drunken Irishmen and dumb Dutchmen. Many antebellum Blacks were prejudiced against European immigrants, and not to mention that the light-skinned Blacks who regarded dark-skinned Blacks as their inferiors. But they are not usually regarded as racists. All things considered, the historical record supports the argument that eminent African-American scholar Benjamin Quarles made 60 years ago. Lincoln was a man without bigotry of any kind, a man who treated blacks as they wanted to be treated, as human beings. Similarly, as David Reynolds argued 2 years ago, Lincoln was a, quote, radical anti-racist and a leftist abolitionist who loathed racism, beneath whose outer veil of moderation and caution there lay a radically progressive self. In conclusion, I'd like to summarize the gist of those chapters in my book dealing with Lincoln's interaction with African Americans, especially those he encountered in Washington. His unfailing cordiality to blacks in general, his willingness to meet with them in the White House, to honor their requests, to invite them to consult on public policy, to treat them with respect and kindness, whether they were kitchen servants or leaders of the Black community, to invite them to attend receptions and tea, to sing and pray with them on their turf, to authorize them to hold events on the White House grounds. All those manifestations of an egalitarian spirit fully justified the tributes paid to him by African Americans, including the sobriquet that Frederick Douglass coined, emphatically, the Black man's president. So that is the gist of my remarks today.
Well, thank you both for what I see as two presentations that are in stark contrast to each other. So the discussion should be quite interesting. Professor Bonner, I'll start with you. Professor Burlingame talked about racial egalitarianism, Lincoln and racial egalitarianism. And he indicates that a lot of the things that we have talked about over the years that would suggest that Lincoln was certainly less racially egalitarian than one might expect, that those things can be explained. Could you comment on some of those?
So thanks for the question, and I'm really glad to be able to engage in this conversation. So I guess thinking about the subject of what I talked about, which is colonization, I'm a little skeptical of the idea and I'm familiar with the idea that the 1862 meeting that I talked about was Lincoln playing politics. I think that there's a lot to be said for Lincoln I was going to use the term astute, but I'll use the term brilliant, as a brilliant politician. I actually think that one of the oddities of this is, and this was part of what led me to the questions that I was asking in my piece, is like, I don't think that Lincoln asking Black people to leave the United States was actually that good of a political act in 1862. I think a lot of people, colonization was on the outs. And so it seems odd as a way to sort of put himself out there as an advocate for this project that most Black people don't favor. And that I think a lot of white people didn't think was actually practical. More importantly than that, though, I think that it's hard for me to reduce that act to a political project, given the things that he's doing around it. The fact that suggestions about colonization fit into or are placed into the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, the fact that he's pursuing these or encouraging and fostering these projects, like actual projects of colonization, Black immigration, whatever it might be, after that meeting. So it's not just this moment where it's I don't view this as just a moment in 1862 where he's building up to and sort of softening the ground for the Emancipation Proclamation. I think that it is it's a part of who Lincoln was. It's a part of his politics. He believes in it. I think the term racial pessimism is useful here. He doesn't believe fully in 1862 and 1863 in a future for Black and white Americans in the same country. I think that that's the things that he did show us the sort of the substance behind that meeting in 1862.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I agree that the point is well taken, that the deeds tell us as much as words. But consider for a moment that Lincoln had written the Emancipation Proclamation. And you'll forgive me if I'm repeating something that you said earlier, because my connection compound.
No, I didn't talk about the proclamation very much.
That he had written the Emancipation Proclamation. He had told his cabinet on July 22nd he was going to issue it. His cabinet said this is a terrible time to do that. It would look insincere coming as it would be on the heels of a major Union defeat. Mm-hmm. Let's wait until there's a Union victory. Mm-hmm. So there's Lincoln. He's got the Emancipation Proclamation. He's going to issue it. Now, he knows that there's going to be a tremendous white backlash, particularly in the border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and the lower north, particularly mm-hmm. Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, Southern Ohio, and Southern Pennsylvania. So what is he going to do to minimize that white backlash? Well, one of the things he has been told time and again by members of Congress, by his good friends in Kentucky, and people all over the place have told him, look, the only way the white public is going to accept emancipation is if it's coupled with colonization. Mm-hmm. So Lincoln's challenge then was to convince the white voters of the lower north and the border states that he was sincere in putting forward his colonization suggestions.
But does that mean that he wasn't sincere? Like, I don't know. I hear the point that many white voters thought that colonization and emancipation had to happen together. I think Lincoln was one of those people who thought colonization and emancipation had to happen together. And so that's one thing I'm thinking. The other thing I'm thinking about is, like, more broadly, so many of the things you noted, which I think are really important, reflect the ways in which Lincoln was responding to what he saw as the intractability of white prejudice. And I guess I wonder, like, what does that mean for how we should think about him as a president, as a leader, as a person with real power, that he's governing in a way to placate racists? How does that fit into how we think about Lincoln and race?
He's governing in a way in which emancipation will be acceptable to the voters of the country, who many of whom will say, look, we're happy to fight a war and pay taxes if that war is designed to preserve the nation. If it's to free Black people, to hell with it. We're not willing to join the army. We're not willing to pay taxes to support an emancipation crusade. And whether we like it or not, that was what Lincoln had to deal with. Now, Lincoln himself, as my book tries to prove, he was instinctively a racial egalitarian in the way he interacted with Black people. That those interactions speak far, far louder than his words. And so now, and another thing that needs to be pointed out about the meeting with those 5 Black gentlemen, and perhaps you talked about this, and forgive me if I missed it, but the striking thing about that is that he invited a shorthand reporter in to cover it and to write a newspaper article so that this gets distributed around the country through the press. So his audience was not really those 5 black gentlemen. His audience,
not solely.
Primarily his audience was the millions of voters in the lower north and the border states who would be more inclined to accept emancipation if they believed that the man who was issuing the Emancipation Proclamation was sincere about his plans for colonization. And Lincoln, let me finish. And he was sincere about colonization insofar as colonization was a humanitarian plan to offer people like Cromwell and others who abandon any hope of having first-class citizenship in the U.S., that they deserve some kind of refuge, some kind of haven abroad where they could go, where they wouldn't be treated like second-class citizens. Now, so colonization, insofar as Lincoln was in favor of it, was largely as a humanitarian measure. And take, for example, the one case where colonization was actually carried out. The whole plan for Central America fizzled. But then in late 1862, he approves, right at the end of 62, a plan for Haitian immigration. And now, why did he go along with that? As you suggest, by late 62, softening up white public opinion had already been done. So why would he authorize this plan for Black people to go to Haiti? Well, the answer seems to have been that he was a humanitarian concern for the conditions that prevailed in contraband camps, particularly in the Norfolk area around Fort Monroe. He was receiving appeals from abolitionists, from Quakers and others saying, look, these people are suffering terribly. We have to do something. And it's not just because of the cold weather, but the Union troops who are supposed to be protecting these Black people are raping them, robbing them, and mistreating them. And the death rate is skyrocketing. Cold weather is about to descend. And so he is persuaded that it would be a humanitarian gesture to allow them to go to Haiti if they wanted to.
What I think I'm really interested in is I'm thinking about the questions that you're raising about and the work you're doing to show the importance of Lincoln's personal interactions with people of African descent. And I think we've heard about that a lot. And I think that is really important, that Black folks could meet with Lincoln and think, oh, I was really glad to have a chance to talk with him. I don't know that counters or should be taken to discount the substantive, the concrete policy things that he did to either promote throughout his, rise of political power and his actual political career, to promote colonization, which is a white supremacist vision, and the substantive things he sort of chose not to do to contest the concrete dimensions, concrete manifestations of prejudice. I think there's something to be said about, and so let me say this in two ways. I think there's something to be said for the things Lincoln did and did not do as president that should be added to our understanding of how he talked with people as a person. I also think that I'm generally I'm less interested in the question of was Lincoln personally prejudiced. I think that's an aspect of that's an important aspect of study for him, but I don't think that tells the full story of personal prejudice. Can't tell us the full story of race in America. A really fundamental part of understanding race in America is understanding power and how power is and is not used to address relations between Black and white people. And I think the story, I'm not familiar with the piece you mentioned about Lincoln thinking of Haiti as a refuge for people from the contraband camps. I think there's an interesting story to be told there about what Lincoln does and doesn't do with his power to address problems regarding racism in the U.S. So I think that's an important part of the story that we shouldn't overlook. It belongs there alongside conversations about his personal perspectives.
Well, and the steps that he takes. Here are Black people suffering badly from disease, mistreatment by Union troops, cold weather. Their attempts to get the northern states to accept them or reject it. Even Massachusetts bends over backwards. Oh no, we don't want to. Don't send 2,000 Black people from contraband camps to us, please, heaven forfend. So what are you supposed to do? And then and also something that should be borne in mind is that while an awful lot of Black leaders said that they were opposed to colonization, when the Central American Plan for Panama came up, thousands of Black people volunteered for it. The leadership was denouncing it, but the actual people were for it. And who was the most vehement critic of Lincoln's plan for Central American colonization that had been outlined to the 5 Black leaders? Who was the most vehement critic? Frederick Douglass. And where he calls Lincoln essentially a Negro hater and all that. Very, very harsh criticism. Frederick Douglass had 3 sons, 2 of whom, they were adult sons, volunteered to go to Panama as part of that plan. So if Lincoln is this hopeless racist, making this hopeless racist plan, why are Frederick Douglass's sons signing up? And why are 14,000 other Black Americans signing up for it?
So 14,000 is far less than 4 million, I'll say. I wouldn't use the term hopeless racist, although you did use the term racial pessimist. And again, I'm not that drawn to this question of whether Lincoln was or was not racist. I'm thinking about the dimensions of what he did and the implications of what he did. And I think to be fair, a lot of the history of African Americans and colonization is defined by an openness to individual Black people saying, hey, I'd like to explore Haiti. I'd like to explore Central America. I might consider Liberia. But when people in positions of power come to advocate for and encourage Black people to leave, what African Americans recognize is that that's going to become a signal to others that Black folks don't belong. And so if Lincoln wants to say, hey, here's some land, go if you want, that's one thing. But when Lincoln writes in the New York, doesn't write, when Lincoln says with New York newspaper reporters in the White House, but for your race among us, there would not be a war, that's going to be harmful, actively harmful to Black people. And I think that's part of what might lead someone like Frederick Douglass to say Lincoln is promoting racism when he calls for colonization, even as his sons say, you know what, this is of interest to me. It's different stakes for the president to say, hey, y'all should leave, versus like for two Black individuals to say, hey, I'm going to think about leaving.
We are running out of time, so I think we need to take a couple of questions from the audience. Professor Bonner, this one is for you. To what extent did the failure of Ile Vache colonization effort lead to Lincoln's abandoning colonization as a national goal?
I think my sense is generally, I'll try to be brief. This is this late moment when there is just a sort of collapse of an attempted colonial settlement that Lincoln has been helping to foster, I'll say. I think my sense is that he's moving away from colonization as a public project, in part because of the sense of the limitations of what can be done, and this collapse of this colony is a part of that. I think he's also moving away from it because of his sense of what Black Americans will and will not accept. And I think I think my sense is that he comes to see that this is just not going to be a productive way to solve problems that the nation is facing. That's my reading of it.
And Professor Burlingame, do you think that his support of voting rights for certain groups of Black men, at least in 1865, in his last speech, and the fact that he's abandoning colonization is an indicator that he has come to the understanding that Black men can be useful to the Republican Party if they are voting in the South, especially?
Yeah, well, absolutely. But that's only part of the picture. I mean, Lincoln regarded Black people as people who deserved decent treatment.
And there was no
like
place.
Sorry, I was going to say it seems like he's thinking politically in addition to thinking personally in that regard, in the same way that he does in many of his other political projects. I don't know, Dr. Manfred, if that's where you're going to go. Sorry to cut you off.
Well, yeah, let's try to get one more question in. This is for both of you. And I think, Professor Burlingame, you've already answered this question, but you might want to restate it. It says, to what do you account the apparent contradictions of Frederick Douglass's statements in 1865 versus 1876? And I think you've pretty much covered that, but if you would just give a few more words on that.
Well, in 1876, Douglass was terribly worried about Reconstruction going down the drain. And he had been so encouraged by the passage of the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and the Civil Rights Act, and the Enforcement Acts, and then encouraged by the Grant administration's enforcement of those laws and backing up those amendments. And then starting with 1873, they seem to lose interest. The country goes through a major depression. The attention of white voters is turned away from justice for Black people, and Lincoln and Frederick Douglass is saying, don't think of this Reconstruction as just do-gooders. Lincoln realized that Black people's rights would help. If Black people had rights, that would be benefit to white people as well. So that was a kind of encoded message, I do believe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you both for great presentations and for a stimulating conversation. And I'd like to thank again Professor Jonathan White as well for his earlier presentation. This concludes our program this evening. And so thank you all for joining us. This is a reminder that we start again tomorrow afternoon at 4:00. So please do join us at that time. Thank you all.
Thanks, Edna.
Thank you.